Hey everyone, this is Jennifer Beamer, owner-operator of Expertly Dyed Art by Science, and this is the daily vlog, episode number 56, and today we are talking about dyed yarn. Out there who have followed Expertly Dyed pretty much since the beginning will know that I actually used to dye yarn. I wasn't just about dyeing wool. Now, when I initially moved to South Korea, dyeing yarn and getting a hold of yarn was very difficult, and because I'm much more invested in dyeing wool and spinning and talking about that as a category, I kind of shifted focus to mainly wool rather than spun wool. Now, I kind of did a soft reboot of Expertly Dyed way back in late 2018, and I kind of got more of a footing in start of 2019, repopulating the shop with new items and that sort of thing. And then in late 2019, I really wanted to relaunch everything that was Expertly Dyed, so I got a new website, which if you haven't been to, please go there. And so I wanted to bring some of the things that I hadn't been doing for a long time back into the Expertly Dyed umbrella. And one of them was yarn. And the last time I actually dyed any kind of yarn was 2012. You can imagine my surprise when I come back to dyeing yarn and I have no idea what it was I was doing. So I got some yarn when I visited my mom back in the States. I had a whole bunch of stuff there in deep storage. And so I shipped it back to me and decided to start experimenting with dyeing small skeins in a more experimental sense, just to kind of get my bearings back before I actually made a purchase for wholesale yarn. And I'm really glad I did. A lot of trends have changed for dyeing yarn over the years, and whereas before it was really in vogue to do more of the striping, self-striping sock yarns, they've kind of gone through a reimagining state. So I'll explain what I mean. This one is one of those self-striping yarns. So it's a 2-yard skein, and so you can kind of see here where the colors shift from one to the next. So it's kind of like a dark bluish green, and then it shifts into a more sagey forest green. And the reason why I dyed it this way is because I wanted something that would kind of have a subtle striping effect. Sometimes when you're in the dye kitchen, you're like, ooh, I'll try this. So yeah, that was my initial thought when I created this, and it will be a beautiful effect in a finished item. But speckle yarn is super duper popular, and part of my relationship with dyeing in general has always been use dye solutions, and because you're not super creative, use a repeatable colorway system, which was a proprietary calculator that I created based on my first master's degree experience back in 2010, and made everything repeatable. No matter what base, no matter how much of it there was, I should be able to do this. And then by keeping track of my method, I could make something that was repeatable from batch to batch, no matter how much time was in between your purchases. Now, doing that is really time consuming, and obviously with a PhD that I'm finishing, I haven't really had a lot of free time. So I've just kind of made do with what I've got, and this experimentation process has allowed me to kind of review the repeatable colorway premise that I originally started with new methods that allows me to have more creative expression with my dyeing. And so with speckle dyed yarns being super popular, one of the things that it goes against is my caveat that is I have to work with dye solutions. Now, with speckle yarns, usually what people will do is they'll take a bit of the dry dye powder out of the jar and they'll sprinkle it over the yarn that has been saturated with vinegar or citric acid. Then they'll let it set either through steam, or sometimes they'll just put it in a low water bath, and then they get these really punchy colors because the way that it's concentrated the dye into that one tiny little spot, it's, you know, a speckle. Now, that doesn't work for me because I don't have a studio, for one. I dye in my kitchen, so I don't want to have all this dry dye powder that I'm using around food items. Even if they're on the other side of the room, those tiny little particles can travel. So I've always minimized my exposure by putting the dye into water as a solution, and then using the solution that has a particular concentration that I then use in conjunction with my calculator. So that has made the challenge of making these speckled dyed yarns a little bit more of a challenge, because I have to deal with this extra issue of working with a dye solution rather than being able to speckle it from the dry dye powder. But I've come up with a method that I think will work. In terms of whether or not it's going to be repeatable, we'll have to wait until after I'm all done with my thesis stuff, because I'm growing gray hair more now than I ever have before during this PhD process. I'm making duos, so if at the very least someone wants to make something a little bigger than a pair of mittens, you'll have 800 meters or just shy of 900 yards to work with. So it's a start, and I'm very excited that I came across this method, because looking at speckled yarns was something that I would occasionally do on Instagram when I was bored or I needed inspiration. And I would think, oh, wouldn't it be so nice? So I've overcome some of the design challenge trying to come up with a safer method to do that, given that I'm just dyeing in my kitchen. The other thing that I have done is I've experimented more with hot pour. Now, that was something I never really did before with my yarn, but I did it with the wool. So it's still something that I do now with wool. I'll do the hot pour method just to get those really intense, super saturated blocks of color in one spot, because with unspun wool there's a tendency for the color to kind of migrate because it's all wet. It's like a sheet of paper, right? So the water will wick up into the paper. So if you think about wool in the same way, if you put the dye in one spot, but because the whole thing is wet, it will actually wick away some of the dye up into the wool. So if you use a hot dye or hot pour method with the wool, then you can actually prevent some of that dye dispersion from happening. And there are other ways to do it. You can do it from a hand paint perspective, where you've got it just mostly dry sitting on a table, and then you can pour the dye over the top. Or you can do it in a low immersion vat dye, where you've got like a crock pot and you've got your wool in there, and then you pour it in a certain way once it's come up to temperature, and then that will cause the dye to adhere pretty immediately to the wool. You always have to be careful, of course, doing this method, because especially with unspun wool, because you can felt it, and this happened to me a few times early on in my dyeing like pre-launch stage for my business. So yeah, I learned early on it was good to not fuss with the wool too much, because when you tried to spin it afterwards, it was a nightmare. So you learn from your mistakes. So I have approached that hot pour method with yarn, and I'm really loving the results. So these were the first 3 that I did, and I really love how they turned out. And these actually are in the shop, so if you're interested in some yarn, you know where to go. And I've kind of worked with this idea a little bit more. So that was the first iteration of experimenting with this type of dyeing. But I've also experimented with white. So one of the things that I learned when I first started making videos was how important it is to make pauses. And in the dyeing world, having these little spots of white are actually just important to set off the contrast as the color is. So with this hot pour method, I've been experimenting with the saturation level. And also white. White is sometimes okay on yarn. I do it all the time with wool and I don't have a problem with it, but for some reason when it comes to yarn, the whole thing needs to be colored. And I've done sort of the same thing here with some of these others. I've also experimented more with hand painting, and I've got these 2 examples here. So I don't only have superwash. I do have some non-superwash available. And in an earlier video I was talking about Malabrigo, and this one here is sort of my version of Malabrigo. You can see it's a single merino. I think it's a worsted weight, although it's a little bit soft sponge, so you could probably do even a sport weight pattern with this one. And again, like I was saying, this hot pour speckle method I've also experimented with as well. So the methods for making these 3 yarns have all been different, and you can see how the effects turn out. So I guess basically what I'm saying is I've had a lot of fun this year, like pretty much in the last month or so. And I'm excited that I've found some ways to kind of get the effect that is a big trend right now without having to sacrifice aspects of my methods that make me feel safe as a dyer. So yeah. So Expertly Dyed now has some hand-dyed yarns, finally completing the whole circle. If you want to see what I have available, you can go to my Etsy site, and you can also go to my website. And on my website, all my prices are less expensive than they are on Etsy because I include shipping for all orders on Etsy rather than on my website, because I wanted to give people choice. Now I do combine shipping and offer discounts, like free shipping over a certain amount of weight, so that if you want just one skein of something, you don't have to worry about overspending in order to get what you want, or budgeting yourself, I guess. So if you want a little bit more flexibility with your buying choices, if you like something on my Etsy page but you only want one thing, go check it out on expertlydyed.com, and you'll be able to just buy it there, pay for the actual cost of postage, and you save yourself some money from not having to overspend on Etsy. So yeah, there's some options there. And also, going to my webpage and buying something actually benefits me a little bit more than it does when you purchase something on Etsy. The reason being is I get more of my profits than with Etsy, where I have to spend quite a lot of them. So if you want to help out a small business, shop on their website if they have one. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and click that notification bell so that you're notified of the next video that comes live. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye!